In my research about the origins of man, in accordance with traditional religious historiographies, I have managed to find several theories that have surprisingly come together well in order to synthesize a coherent narrative that can be backed up with religious tradition, archaeology, cultural anthropology, linguistics, and genetics. I call this theory the regenesis out of Mahabharata theory. In previous videos that I have produced, I have made several claims of relevance, such as a Christian, I interpret Noah's flood as a worldwide disaster in accordance with the countless world flood myths found throughout the ancient cultures and religions of the world. I am convinced that Noah's Ark landed on the Ararat Mountains as described in the book of Genesis. Ararat, or Ururatu, in ancient Assyrian is a word meaning highest place. I thus believe that the Ararat mountain range would only refer to the Himalayan mountains of northern India, upon which seashells have been found in abundance. Furthermore, it is stated in Genesis chapter 11 that the descendants of Noah built a tower in the land of Shinar, known as the Tower of Babel. Scripture clearly teaches that they settled in Shinar after migrating from the east. If Shinar is in Babylon, which is today called Iraq, then the only mountain ranges east of it are the Himalayan mountains of North India. In the Vedas, the North Indian region is referred to as Aryavata, meaning the land of the Aryans. All ancient religious tradition and history is written as though the Aryan people were indigenous to North India, and not wanderers from the Ukrainian steppe region as the Aryan invasion theory claims. Indeed, even the archaeological evidence seems to point in the direction of the Bible and the Vedas when it comes to this issue. The Indus Valley civilization is thought to be the oldest discovered post-flood civilization, which once again is evidence of the accuracy of all religious traditions regarding the homeland of the Aryan people. Contrary to the claims of European neo-pagan nationalists and Indian cultural Marxists, the term Aryan had a far different meaning than one may be aware of. So, who is Arya? Arya means a noble person or gentleman. India is the birthplace of language, mathematics, religion, and it is the cradle of the human race. All roads lead to India. Sanskrit is the mother of all the world's living languages. Even Western scientists declare that Sanskrit is the most pure of all the world's languages. Sanskrit is the sacred language of ancient pre-Brahmin Sanatan Dharma, and it is also the source of European languages and even English. Contrary to what Western scholars and archaeologists claim, India is the cradle of mankind, and it was from India that the geography of the world was first explored and settled by. The Mayans, the Aztecs, the Egyptians, the Phoenicians, and Aboriginals, colloquially called Indians, all have their origins in India. The ancient world was once ruled from India, and that is a provable fact. An in-depth presentation of this study can be found in 55 chapters of the following blog. In the following presentation, I will attempt to expand on these ideas and hopefully paint a better picture of the oldest elements of human history. So let us get started. Most established religions of the world today contain myths of a world flood that was brought forth by the will of heaven. The world that existed before this deluge is biblically known as the antediluvian age. Not much can be known about the world that was before the Great Flood, but what we can infer is that the people of the antediluvian age were a united people that lived roughly in the same geographical regions and shared a common world culture and world language. Even today, we can trace back these ties between various nations, cultures, and traditions by implementing comparative cultural anthropology and mythology. It is rather alarming how much the oldest traditions and beliefs of various peoples and cultures share in common, almost as if to reveal that they all share a common heritage rooted in a real objective universal history. Traditions of lost continents that have sunk into the ocean have brought forth much intrigue and awe in the psyche of men throughout history. Even today, children are fascinated by impressive tales about Atlantis and the Atlantean civilization as described by Plato in the 4th century before Christ. Atlantis, of course, is the most famous name given for the concept of a sunken civilization from the antediluvian age. However, there is a lesser-known one by the name of Lemuria. Lemuria was an idea popularized in 1864 by zoologist and biographer Philip Sclater, who noticed something strange when analyzing what he believed to be lemur fossils. He found fossils in both India and Madagascar, but nowhere else between the two landmasses. So if lemurs could not even swim to Africa from Madagascar, how on earth could they have gotten to India or vice versa? To answer this question, Sclater wrote, quote, "The anomalies of the mammal fauna of Madagascar can best be explained by supposing that a large continent occupied parts of the Atlantic and Indian Oceans." End quote. Sclater went on to describe these lands in more detail, saying, quote, "This continent was broken up into islands, of which some have become amalgamated with Africa, some with what is now Asia, and in Madagascar and the Mascarene Islands we have existing relics of this great continent for which I should propose the name Lemuria." End quote. Lemuria was suggested to look something like this. This, of course, was not the first time that a lost continent in the Indian Ocean had been proposed. In fact, sunken land bridges were used to explain similarities in species, rock formations, and missing links during that time. However, this was the first time that it was popularized with a catchy name. The theory of Lemuria gained notable acceptance within the scientific community of the time, and it began to appear in other scientific papers and maps soon after. It was even proposed that humanity itself originated in Lemuria, and that is why no fossil of early human origins have ever been found. This theory reflects an old tradition by the Tamil people of southern India who recognize Lemuria within their own legends of a lost land in the Indian Ocean which they call Kumari Kandam. This great land beneath India was described in both ancient Tamil and ancient Sanskrit literature. It also resembles the description of Lemuria given by Sclater rather alarmingly well. Adherents of this theory try to prove Kumari Kandam as the cradle of all humanity and civilization, and it is this notion that shall serve as the foundation for the regenesis out of Mahabharata theory. As stated before, we can infer that the antediluvian world was one where humanity was united as one family and culture of people, as this was also the case after the flood, up until the Tower of Babel narrative found in Genesis chapter 11 of the Christian Bible. So we assume accordingly that the antediluvian world may in fact have been Kumarikandam, or Lemuria to the English-speaking world. The Book of Genesis and the Vedas share a similar tradition when it comes to the narrative of a man and his family surviving a worldwide flood. Two Vedic equivalents of Noah exist. One by the name of Nyahu, with the phonetic similarity to Noah being obvious, and the other one being by the name of Manu. The former, Nyahu, is said to have had with him family members who built an ark and took upon it all the animals and herbs that were to be saved from the destruction of the world flood. The latter, Manu, is said to have landed on the mountains of Malaya, which are today known as the Himalaya. The Himalaya region of North India is also roughly the region in which Aryavata is located according to the Vedas, Aryavata being the homeland of the Aryan people. The regenesis out of Mahabharata theory thus proposes that the events between the expulsion of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden up until Noah's flood may have all taken place in the sunken continent of Lemuria. That it was Lemuria, or a sunken supercontinent like it, that was once the entire antediluvian world in which all of humanity existed as one culture and people. Further yet, it proposes that the location in which Noah's Ark settled must have and could have only been north of Lemuria in the Himalayan mountains, which are biblically known as the Mountains of Ararat, with Ararat again being a phonetically alternative pronunciation of Aryavat, homeland of the Aryans. The mainstream view among archaeologists of the American evangelical Christian persuasion is that Noah's Ark had been discovered on a mount by the name of Ararat in Armenia by an explorer named Ron Wyatt in the 1990s.
John, as a scientist, might I take the liberty here to ask you, do you really honestly believe that you have been on the remains of Noah's Ark?
I have no doubt in my mind. This has to be a man-made structure. It's full of metal. The metal has a regular pattern to it, and the size of the thing and the shape of the thing is such that it's almost certainly a large boat.
However, outside of this circle of like-minded individuals, this supposed discovery had found little to no traction, and with good reason. The discovery of this structure in no way or form guarantees that this is in fact Noah's Ark, or even a structure from the antediluvian period. The regenesis out of Mahabharata theory proposes instead that the correct location of Noah's Ark can only be the Himalaya mountains of North India. The following is a reading from a book from the year 1818 by Thomas Hemming of Magdalen Hall in Oxford. It is titled, A Complete Survey of Scripture Geography containing an historical account of primitive nations and of all countries and people mentioned in sacred history, to which is prefixed an introduction essay concerning the origin, occasion, character, and meaning of each book or writing in the Holy Bible, with brief memoirs of the inspired writers, wherein also the most difficult subjects of Mosaic history are clearly and fully confirmed by physical reasons and proofs, deduced from the present improved state of science, with a list of texts, versions, paraphrases, and targums in all languages into which the holy writings have been translated or converted. Section 14 states the following, quote, The questions that next present themselves are, where was the place called Ararat, and in what part of the earth did Noah and his family discipline and instruct the increasing generations till the dispersion? The clue to guide us towards Ararat is in its position with respect to Shinar. There is no dispute whatever as to the geography of the latter place, and it is unequivocally stated by Moses that they journeyed from the east thither. Nobody can for a moment suppose that the holy sage knew not the distinctions of the cardinal points, or that he would call the north the east. Had Armenia been the place of Noah's debarkation, Moses would undoubtedly have called it north of Shinar. By his positive directions, we are then forbidden to seek for Ararat or the Ark anywhere in Armenia. Notwithstanding the English versions of Isaiah and Jeremiah put Ararat for Armenia, it is no authority for surpassing that the Ark rested there. Neither of these prophets allude to that country as the part into which the residue of mankind were carried by the current of the waters. Their prophecies refer to quite another subject. The name of Ararat was probably first imposed by Noah on the country to which he was drifted, and it might be expressly descriptive of something relative to the mercy which he had experienced there, or suitable to the new features of the world. But etymologists have afforded no derivation of it, so that its origin remains uncertain. Moses would most probably receive the word from the Abrahamic family, through whom the inestimable tradition which he has bequeathed to posterity were preserved. Abram was a native of Chaldea, and was no stranger to the territory northward, even to the districts of Armenia, and in describing any country thereabouts. It is not to be supposed that he would have called it the East, because he would have been capable of saying something more distinctly remarkable concerning such a memorable circumstance as the dispersion, had it taken place in a neighboring province. Armenia, having been called Ararat from 17th to 19th centuries afterwards, may be imputed to some tribes which emigrated thither from the maternal colony, choosing to impose the name as a standing memorial to posterity of the event to which it related. Or it might bear some physical resemblance to the country from which they had been transplanted, though the former is the more probable cause. Titles have been transferred on the same account to cities in various parts of the earth, which may be deemed monuments of Noah's preservation now existing. When by the divine alloquy he was pre-admonished to construct the Teba, or Ark, the name imposed upon it may be called an original appellation, and one of very extraordinary signification, of the force of which our translations affords no parallel. Hence the emigrants who planted early cities in different parts of the earth called them Teba. Egypt, Greece, Turkey, and many other countries have still each their Teba, or Thebes, and the same memorial was, doubtless, intended on founding Tibet in the farthest India. But there are very few places that retain their primitive title. Names are the most mutable of anything in history or geography. Seas, countries, cities, mountains, rivers have in succession of empires and in many revolutions of states exchanged titles. We might therefore just as well call Egypt Greece, because it contains Thebes, as Armenia Ararat, because a mountain so called is to be there seen. It must be strictly noticed that Moses states the ark to have rested on the mountains of Ararat and not the mountain, alluding evidently to a course or chain of acclivities, and not to one precise spot. In the Targum of Jonathan, they are rendered the mountains of Kudrum. In the Targum of Onkelos, the mountain of Kardu. Calerius says the Gordinian mountains, which he supposes to be part of Taurus, are the scriptural Ararat. Quintus Curtius says that the mountains of Taurus and Caucasus stretch eastward throughout India, even to the eastern coast of China. The Holstein ambassadors under Brueguel, who traveled all Asia, confirm Curtius, and particularly remark that Taurus, Caucasus, and the Gordarian mountains so clearly join that tract of heights which crosses Asia to the east that it appears like one continuation of mountains. Procopius tells us that Paropamisus was called Caucasus out of the compliment to Alexander when he pursued his conquest into India, and Buno observes that this mountain is so high that the sun shines upon its top for 2 hours after setting. Megasthenes, Strabo, and Pliny call the mountains Paropamisus. What name it bore previously they do not inform us. By Cluverius and Mela it is called Taurus, from its being supposed a continuation of the mountain of Lesser Asia so called. By Curtius it is called Caucasus, and in modern geography it is styled Himalaya and Hindu Ko. But these may all be called modern names in comparison to the date in which Moses alludes. The Indians call one part of this immense ridge Aryavart, on which they say the ark reposed after the deluge, and the author of Asiatic Researches says that the Indians hold this tradition with sacred veneration. This district, indeed the whole of the Persian and Indian part of the Great Chain, bears eastward from Shinar, and by some further arguments it is possible that a very unscriptural opinion with regard to Ararat may be removed. It is a question which deeply concerns the whole course of affairs connected with the early history of mankind, and unless it can be settled, the documents of Moses will be still obscure and unintelligible in this respect. It is partly owing to the accounts brought by different travelers that this grand mistake has become so prevalent. Elmasinus, Chardin, Trevrot, Herbert, Stroyce, and others pretend to have visited Ararat, but their accounts of it are very contradictory. Some say that they climbed to the top of the mountain and could see 130 miles. Others say that it is quite inaccessible. Others that the ark is still on the top, but none of them profess to have seen it there. If, however, the authority of their several stories be examined, they will be found to arise from the most incredible and absurd legends. Not one of them has brought home any satisfactory or positive information, and they have each procured such a different statement that if either one were true, all the others must have been false. Josephus, Berosus, and some other ancient historians mentioned reports of the ark having rested in Armenia, and that a part of it was to be seen for many ages after. But neither of these, or any other ancient writers, has produced any proofs more than reports. If then the positive information of Moses be preferable to reports and legends, we must not look northward of Shinar for the memorable place where Noah and his family debarked, and for that station where they were afterwards employed in rearing a new progeny, in teaching laws, and in preparing those generations that were to found states in every corner of the earth. Arguments to elucidate this part of the Mosaic account must for the most part be presumptive. But when a combination so cogent tends to confirm a declaration so explicit, it amounts to that sort of proof which the ancients called apagogical. As Moses refers to no particular tor, but to mountains, and as the vast ridge from the west to the east of Asia strictly corresponds in some parts with the line of reference to Shinar, it may be with much reason inferred that these were by Moses alluded to, in a general sense, as the mountains of Ararat, and which might be their title originally for the names before mentioned, by which they have been generally or partially called Argratian and not indigenous. The observations of Buno, Bruegel, and other travelers of the last century, as to the extraordinary heights of these mountains, seems to have been made from view only, but by various altimetrical experiments, since made by some French academicians. They have been proven to be at least 5,000 feet higher than any other known mountains of the earth, and though so very lofty, yet are they accessible without much difficulty. Remarkably luxuriant values interpret the continuity of these acclivities, some of the finest of which are towards the sources of the Indus and Ganges, and where the Oxus, Jaxartes, and other currents issue. These districts are stated to be almost spontaneously fruitful, congenial to all the necessities and so many luxuries of life. It may, also, as a peculiar fact, be remarked that this country is seated near the center of the three grand portions of the earth, as they appear to have been allotted to the three distinct races of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Megasthenes, the earliest writer who has described this eastern territory, informs us that India was divided into 122 nations by the sons and descendants of Noah before they went to Shinar, and historians are unanimous in the opinion of the early plantation of India and of it having become very populous previous to any settlement of Europe. Herodotus, Siculus, Strabo, and Pliny evince that the nations of the Scythians, from whom all the European peoples descend, were in fact Indians, or Persic Indians called Sacae, afterwards in other dialects Sassones and also Saxons, and the same testimonies might be applied to the original stock of most other colonies. In addition to these and many other ancient writers, our own eminent historians and antiquaries, Stuckley, Heylin, and Rayleigh, with others of high celebrity, have judged that the original seminary of mankind was in the east of Persia. As, therefore, it appears from the Mosaic history that Terah corresponded not with Noah, Shem, Ham, or Japheth personally, with all of whom he was contemporary, that as Abram does not remark any things of Shem, his ancestor, who survived Abram's birth 150 years, nor of Ham, nor Japheth, Noah, and his sons, and their immediate descendants could not have cultivated Armenia, that as the regions of India, Persia, and Tartary, on the universal suffrage of history, were the most ancient populace, and as numerous hordes issued hence into different quarters of the earth, that, as Moses expressly intimates, the coming of the Babylonish colony from the east, from these and many other evidences, we are contained to decide that the mountains of Ararat extended far into India, and that Noah, upon the succession of the flood, occupied a tract, most probably, all circumstances considered, somewhere about the sources of these great rivers, the Indus, the Ganges, the Oxus, and Jaxartes." End quote. A prevalent view that has existed for a while now is that the Mesopotamian civilization is the oldest post-antediluvian civilization. However, this is continually being challenged and refuted on multiple fronts. Competing against this notion is the Indus-Sarasvati Valley civilization, which some estimate as being the mother of the Chinese Huanghe Valley civilization, the Mesopotamian Tigris-Euphrates Valley civilization, and the Egyptian Nile Valley civilization. It is important to realize that the sacred texts of various established religions, including that of the Christian Bible, all unanimously agree that Mesopotamia and its civilization was birthed out of a people who migrated from the east. The Vedas clearly state that any and all migrations took place out of the Indus and never into it. The Iranic Avestas of Zoroastrianism confirm that civilization in Iran originated with settlers who migrated from the east, a clear reference to the Indus Valley. And, as mentioned before, Genesis chapter 11 verse 2 reveals that the plains of Shinar in Mesopotamia were settled by people that came from the east. Thus one has three religious texts, the Vedas, the Avestas, and the Bible, all confirming that the Indus Valley civilization came first, and that Mesopotamia is a daughter civilization of the Indus Valley. Furthermore, there is ample evidence that Abram and Sarai, whom the Lord God would later name Abraham and Sarah, were in fact descendants of an Aryan, Vedic, and Indic people who had settled in Ur of the Chaldees. Abraham's father, Terah, may have been of a Brahmin priest caste who had unfortunately fallen into idolatry. The Lord God's calling of Abraham represents many things, but it could also represent a rediscovery of the supreme Lord of the Vedas that had been sadly forgotten by the Aryan peoples. Abraham thus represented a rebirth of what was lost. The purging of the idolatry of his people and the renewed relationship with the true Brahman of the Vedas now culminated into a covenant that would eventually be known as the Israelite Covenant. For more information on this, I recommend the literature of Jean D. Matlock, who has done excellent research on the topic of the spread of humanity and its races and nations out of India. But what about the realm of genetics? According to mainstream views on this topic, India today is one of the most diverse places in the world. It is commonly claimed that the Indian population is made up of various ethnic and racial groups that had migrated into India and mixed together. This certainly is one way to interpret the genetic makeup of the various populations of India. However, it is important to understand that information and data can often yield more than one valid interpretation. According to the Aryan invasion theory, the genetic marker R1a originated in the Eurasian steppe region and spread in multiple waves over time to mainly Eastern Europe and northwestern India, Afghanistan, and Iran. This view is based on the presupposition of a Proto-Indo-European language and people group. The problem, however, is that there is no concrete basis for this belief. The philosophic foundation is rather arbitrary, and worse yet, contradicts the anthropological and linguistic evidences as well as multiple sacred religious traditions and historiographies. This arbitrary philosophic presupposition of a Proto-Indo-European language and people group is then popularized in media and academia as a monolithic view with no oppositional views. Thus, sadly, many people are simply not made aware of the alternatives. The genetic data can also be interpreted in a different fashion. If we were to assume India as the cradle of all post-antediluvian civilization, and thus the rebirth of humanity after the world flood, the manner in which we are to view Indian genetics is that of a template people who continue to evolve genetically into the modern nations and races around the world that we see today. When one looks at the genetics and phenotypes of various Indic peoples, one can essentially find contained within all Indians the unevolved genetic and phenotypical precursors to virtually every nation and race of people on Earth today. The regenesis out of Mahabharata theory thus proposes that the genetic diversity we see among all peoples of the world today is explained simply through breeding practices and continual adaptations that occurred as the original template peoples of India spread throughout and into the rest of the world and evolved into the genetic and phenotypical diversity that we see today. Indeed, we find within India contained a miniaturized map of the entire world itself. Eastern Indians are the template people for all Asiatic and American Mongoloid races, while Northwestern Indians are the template people for all European Caucasoid races. Even the Southern Indians contain within them the template peoples for both the Negroid and Australoid races. So how do we know that these Indic populations are in fact the template precursors that evolved into all nations and races, rather than the result of the mixing of all nations and races? Christians may understand this theologically through what the New Testament says in Acts chapter 17 verse 26, quote, "And he hath made of one blood all nations of men for to dwell on all the face of the earth, and hath determined the times before appointed and the bounds of their habitation." End quote. It must also be understood that all established ancient religious traditions throughout the world proclaim the brotherhood of all humanity regarding its origins. The notion that a people are not historically related via some common heritage to an originally created mankind is essentially absent from all ancient religious traditions. This is no different in the Aryan Avestas of Iran, nor the Aryan Vedas of India. The secular argument, however, can be found in the following. Indian populations of people have the most recessive genes in the world. This means that when an Indian marries a non-Indian, the offspring will most often than not inherit its traits from the non-Indian, as this image clearly shows. Furthermore, Indians are the most phenotypically dynamic people, encompassing a wide range of ancestral traits to all other nations and races. No other group of people in the world can both simultaneously be the fairest and the darkest people on Earth. No other group of people have the ability to evolve dark skin while maintaining blue, yellow, or green eye colors, which are typically considered an extremely recessive trait. Only Indic populations contain people who appear like bridgeways between multiple nations and races of the world while simultaneously having extremely recessive genetics, thereby indicating that these people were not the result of mixture from foreign populations outside of India, but rather that they are lesser evolved template peoples who would later leave India and evolve into the diverse nations and races of the world today. The regenesis out of Mahabharata theory thus postulates that people with the most recessive genetics are the oldest and closest to the original template people, while people with the most dominant genetics are the newest and most differentially evolved people. Ironically, this would imply that Negroid and Australoid races are not the oldest races, but rather the youngest. Meanwhile, European and Asiatic races are thus older and genetically closer to the original template people of Lemuria, Atlantis, or whatever other name for a sunken supercontinent one may want to come up with. Will Durant once stated the following, quote, "India was the motherland of our race, and Sanskrit the mother of Europe's languages. India was the mother of our philosophy, of much of our mathematics, of the ideals embodied in Christianity, of self-government and democracy. In many ways, Mother India is the mother of us all." End quote. Mark Twain seconded this by saying, quote, "India is the cradle of the human race, the birthplace of human speech, the mother of history, the grandmother of legend, and the great-grandmother of tradition. Our most valuable and most instructive materials in the history of man are treasured up in India only." End quote. Not only did the Aryans originate in India, but so did the so-called Jews. Flavius Josephus states, quote, "These Jews are derived from the Indian philosophers. They are named by the Indians Kalani." End quote. Megasthenes, who was sent to India by Seculus Nicator about 300 years before Christ, and whose accounts from new inquiries are every day acquiring additional credit, says that the Jews, quote, "were an Indian tribe or sect called Kalani," end quote.